Hey everyone, welcome to this our third sort of conversation about Hardt and Negri's Multitude. But I thought this week, given the fact that we were just watching Michael Hardt's talk last week, that maybe we should direct our attention to some of their more recent work. And of course, you can always read the rest of Multitude on your own time, but wouldn't it be useful to have some insights into how the Multitude, which is a basic framework that they're offering, which I think leads very strongly into the kind of context that we find ourselves in with Occupy. I mean, I think there's a lot, Multitude anticipates a lot of Occupy and the camps from the Arab Spring. And I thought it would be interesting to look at their newer work, Declaration, which is a very short work. And in a way, it doesn't really need to be a long work, actually. You can buy it for $1, I think, on Amazon for your Kindle. Or you can buy the print version for a bit more money, but it's very cheap. I think it's only 99 pages long, and I've been spending some time reading it recently with a view to trying to understand where Michael Hardt was coming from in his talk last week that we went to see. And I thought today I'd do two things. That one, I would talk about the talk. I wrote a blog entry about this over the weekend, and you can read it at my website. I don't know if you guys know that I have one of those, but it's occupyirtheory.info. That's my blog. So I've put a post there, and I've already sent that on to the folks at the Department of Political Science in Athens, and they're going to, I think, read it as well. I'm not sure if they'll have much to say, but I'm interested in anyone's reactions to that. But I'd be very interested in your reactions too. So we can talk a little bit today about what happened in the talk when Michael Hardt came, and what he said and what he didn't say. And then we can talk, maybe instead of talking about the Multitude text, we can talk about the newer text, this short text, which is Declaration. Because I think there's some things there in Declaration that Hardt clarifies that are useful for us if we want to understand what was going on in the talk last week. I don't think it changes what was going on in the talk last week, but I think it modifies it or inflects it a little bit, and that's certainly worth trying to get our heads around or to understand a bit better. So okay, let's start then just by talking about the right to the common. And Michael Hardt had a couple of things to say. I just sort of made some rough notes when I was listening to the talk, and I think some of the things that I heard him say basically is that what's really unifying, and of course, you know, we've been talking, if you go back to the lectures that we've had already on Multitude, you know that this has been a common theme all the way through the Multitude text. So it's interesting how that language comes right back into central focus now that Hardt is talking about the Occupy phenomena and the Arab Spring. So he's saying right away that what's at the center of the struggle, of the movement, is the right to the common. Right. This is the idea that today, as you heard him say, it's not just the environmental common or the common resources, but the common stuff, which is basically language and the ability to make people feel things, feel certain ways, to build relationships, the capacities to build relationships. These are all the things that postmodern labor is very, very good at doing. We live in an era of postmodern production. We live in an era of post-Fordist production. We live in an era whereby people spend more money on things that have symbolic importance than actual sort of utility in the sort of pure sense, right? So their use value of an item, of a running shoe, is not really what you're paying when you buy a Nike swoosh running shoe. You're paying for something more than that. And you and I, we've all talked about my favorite TV show, Mad Men, a few times, and you know that one of the reasons I like the show Mad Men is because they focus on this sort of recruitment of the ability to generate a sort of sympathetic reaction to the symbolic value of a product more than the actual product itself. I mean, cigarettes are terrible things, right? That you shouldn't actually, if you think about it, probably shouldn't buy them at all. But we do buy them, and the reason we buy them is because we like the symbolic effect. So we do live in an age where human labor is more and more oriented towards the common through the ability to use language, through the ability to solicit sympathies and sympathetic responses to products, through the ability to create relationships with other people. So there's obviously ways in which we are very, very postmodern in our post-Fordist, if you want to use that term, and that we use the common. So the problem, of course, is that the common is sort of, while we have all these capacities, the value of the common is being extracted cynically in profit by the corporations, and therefore, although they have colonized these capacities that we have in the life world to care for each other and to create sympathies in each other and this kind of thing, relationships with each other, all of this is now being sort of co-opted, and we want it back, basically, right? We want to be able to be the masters of our own effective relationships again, and we want to have the value of those relationships restored to us and not have the profit extracted from us. So the new capitalism is just as bad as the old capitalism insofar as we don't get paid what we deserve to be paid, but it's also wretched in some ways because, as we've discussed in Multitude, you know, even the way of measuring that value is difficult to sort of get our heads around now, because we're not just exploited in the workplace. You know, we're working in the shower, we're working all the time, we're constantly deployed. Even if we're unemployed, we're employed. You know, this is something we've been talking about before. So we've talked about this before, and all that was useful, I think, over the last 2 weeks to talk about before we actually went and saw Michael Hart speak, because we now know the stakes. And one of the first things Michael Hart said in the lecture was that, you know, let's not kid ourselves about the ability of the left wing or the right wing to be able to, the traditional left or the traditional right at least, to be able to help us get back to a decent, you know, way of relating and distributing wealth and rewards for the use of our labor. It's hard for us to get there with what he calls the zombie ideologies, because they either A, double down on free market solutions, which, you know, free market solutions pretty much caused the crisis in the first place that we're in right now, he would argue, so no point in doing that. But also the traditional left-wing alternatives like Keynesian economics seem to have failed as well, because they can be corrupted very easily. They can, they tend to sort of bully people, you know, for example, using the cover of science. They create sort of status bullying and push people around a little bit. You know, if you want to build a highway through here, well, you know, science says this is the best place for the highway, so the people who live there have no rights. You know, it's a sort of it's totalitarian in its own way, right? So you have to sort of split our dual totalitarianisms, and the Occupy movements, today's cycle of struggles, engages in double combat against this. It engages in combat against neoliberalism for the public, as Michael Hart said, but once you win the public, then we have to fight it for the common, right? So we obviously want to steer. I suppose our first battle is to get a recognition of public goods and services, and that's why we maybe, or at least in the first round, we swing for Keynesianism, but then we fight that. We have to fight that for the common, because the state will co-opt Keynesian economics. It'll militarize it. It will scientize it, and it will ultimately contrive to find ways to prevent democracy from triumphing in the administration of the common. So this is, of course, what happened in the Soviet Union. It's what socialist countries are renowned for. And the Multitude, today's cycle of struggles, they won't stand for that, okay? They don't want to have their revolution lost in this party structure, this vertically integrated statist party structure, and with its various types of corruption. So how do we know that this is what the Multitude want? In Michael Hart's talk, he said that, well, the evidence is partially empirical. You know, you can actually see how veteran protesters travel to and from each other's encampments all around the world to learn, to share knowledges, to learn from each other. but he said, like, you don't really need to trace those connections. That they did happen, but you don't really need to trace them, because the burden of the argument doesn't really rest on that. It's actually more philosophical in some ways, that the form of the protest, which was, of course, the camp, right? This idea of a seizing of a space and a creating of a what we'll later discuss as time. But let's just focus on the space right now, the actual geographical space. It suggests what he calls a destituent process, a sort of an intervention in the order of things, and a sort of a rupturing of that order of things, right? A creating of a symbolic shock, if you will, in the order of things, and in the way that they demonstrated, there was an intuition, I think he seems to be saying in his talk, of the need for a new politics, even if not all the protesters were fully conscious of this need for new politics, right? And that's something I've sort of questioned. If you look at my blog entry, I look at some of the kind of weird people I saw when I went to the Occupy encampment in Dublin, in Ireland, and there were some people there that were very kind of like, in my view, very nationalistic. They wanted an Ireland that was for Irish people, and they wanted to get Europe out of Ireland, get Ireland out of the European Union, and it seemed to me that there was a sort of a sense that they were thinking, oh, it'd all be okay if we just went back to the sort of classical 19th century dreams of socialism, and I don't know that the protesters were conscious of the fact that what they were encamping for, what they were, this would be Michael Hart's assertion, right? And I want to be very, very clear in stating this, because I think it's hugely important. And I mean, if we learn nothing else, I think from this conversation, I think it should be precisely this, that the form of the encampment and the assembly model that was used, even in the Irish protest, stands in direct contradiction to the desires of those particular Irish protesters that I mentioned. I don't think all Irish protesters were involved in thinking that way, but certainly a lot of the propaganda and materials that were being handed out that I saw seemed to be quite anti-EU and anti-difference, getting Ireland out of the EU. And I believe that Hart and Negri's federalist approach to the encampments and the idea of differential incorporation of the encampments on a global basis, it would really run against that. And I think Hart and Negri have a superior understanding of what was going on in the Occupy model than some of the protesters that I saw in Ireland did. But Hart seems to be suggesting that that's okay, right? Because the fact that the process was brought together at all suggests that there was consensus, at least, about the process. And that's hugely important, because it means that perhaps there was still space for the process to be a kind of a pedagogical protest, to teach the protesters who were maybe not fully conscious of what they were doing, that there were there was a sort of an openness to the other, as we say, a differential inclusion of the other, and certainly this is a gesture or an opening towards a very profoundly global resistance to power. And I think in my blog piece, I sort of I maybe hadn't quite seen this when I wrote the blog piece, but I think I see it now. One of the complaints and I guess that I had about the talk was the fact that I didn't understand or didn't see any sort of suggestion on his part to overcome this kind of tendency that I thought I had seen in the Irish Occupy movements. I thought Hart was simply just sort of suggesting that the Occupy movement was in favor of the common by fiat, and that I was sort of thinking, no. Like, if you look at the actual protesters themselves, you see that they are maybe not all on board with that. But I think he's right. I think there is a sort of a structural tendency embedded in the camp, which shows an intuitive awareness of a differential inclusion, and the need for differential inclusion, and the need for new politics, even if in various instances protesters were maybe expressing viewpoints that were not fully consistent with that. So the Occupy protest would have to presumably continue until that process was somehow resolved, that everyone was more fully, properly conscious of what Occupy was for. And I guess that's part of what we're about to discuss now, which is one issue that Hart raised, which is, how does the desire for the common become fully effective? How does it become Prince, right? This is, of course, borrowing from Machiavelli's The Prince, which many of you have read with me in or come across with me before in other classes. We've talked about Machiavelli. So you know that Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince, which was a book written as a letter to the Prince of Florence. And therein Machiavelli was advising the prince how to become a prince, how to become a powerful manager of the people, how to use fear and how to use love to create your reign, a successful reign. And I think, in a way, the use of the prince here is an interesting idea. How does the multitude create its power? How does it create its basis in power? Also, I think an interesting question that came up that Hart mentioned in his talk was the question of the mole, and the metaphor of the mole versus the metaphor of the car with no headlamps rushing through the city streets. I was a little uncertain about that metaphor. I think later on he sort of changed his register a little bit, and he mentioned like the idea of a virus that could modulate itself to fit in different hosts. And I think either way, whichever way you want to look at it, what Hart's trying to identify is a kind of a genealogical relationship between the encampments, the current protests, and previous protests. And that genealogy is a genealogy of horizontalism, which has a sort of similar organizational commitment, but a different expressive commitment. So the organizational commitment would be the horizontalism. The expressive commitment would have been, maybe, say, if you look at Seattle in 1999 and the cycle of struggles that followed around the year or two after that, they were chasing the World Trade Organization around the globe, going to these various sort of Davos summits and things like this to try to interrupt them, to inveigh upon them with demands for justice. But the camp doesn't do that. The camp obviously is a different kind of approach, a different strategy altogether, and perhaps in some ways was more successful, as Hart and Negri argue, in Declaration. So if that was Hart's talk, and I've mentioned some of my own sort of dissatisfactions with it, perhaps, that I wanted him to say a little bit more about this becoming Prince. I feel that in in Declaration certain things become clearer. I don't think we get answers to the questions that we want. We still don't really get advice about how the multitude can become Prince. But Hart, just as in Hart's talk, there was a sort of a strong suggestion in Declaration of the nature of the goals, and it's nicely done. It's obviously Hart can't just read from the book when he's giving a talk, because the book would take hours to read out, of course. But there's definitely some things in the text which I think show some depth to themes and ideas which he mentioned during his talk, and so I'll mention some of those. I think one of the things that just got a little bit more elaborated in the book are the sort of four axes of subjectification, are the four ways in which we are dominated today as a multitude. Even if we don't think of ourselves as the multitude, we in our different struggles, we are united by the fact that the struggles that we engage in today usually involve these axes. Our indebtedness, i.e. the fact that the economy is in a crisis right now and many of us are in debt. The fact that we're so dominated and propagandized by the media. To securitize the fact that we are sort of constantly rigged for war, even though there's no real war in the sense that, you know, nation states aren't at war with each other. What we have are sort of police operations. We have failed states on the one hand, where our police forces are going in, our militarized police forces are going in, but the armies that we're sending in are, you know, they're doing police jobs. You know, they're not exactly attacking or invading other countries. They're trying to build the states there. They're trying to build order there. So it's kind of interesting in that sense. But also for ourselves, you know, the fact that we worried so much about the enemy within. Now today that we have put up so much security at our airports and our city streets, we're constantly being scrutinized, checked, and I think people want to sort of recognize that as a kind of an infringement upon our freedom. And then, of course, the represented, we all know only too well about the corruption of our representative politicians, and so we want to, and Hardenegger in their book want to recognize the need to gain some distance from them. I think one of the things that comes through in the book, it sort of very quickly summarizes some of the things that are stated in Multitude. The fact that neoliberalism today lets corporations just run wild, run free. The fact that production is now increasingly in the common, and production, you know, is now relying upon the common as a resource for creating value. Hence, of course, going back to some of the themes of the past 2 weeks, the factory has overspilled its walls and is now within the entire, has sort of penetrated into the entirety of society. So if we have neoliberalism letting corporations run the show, if production has now absorbed the common, and consequently the value is increasingly mediated, or premised rather upon the resources of the common. And then the third point they would sort of note is maybe one that we haven't talked about so much yet, but it's predicated on the same idea of the common being central to production, that crisis is everywhere. And why is that the case? Why is an era of post-Fordist production inherently an era of crisis? Well, because of the incommensurate relations of production to the actual reality of how value is made, right? So we still live in an age where we measure value based on individual effort, individual ownership of goods and services, and the sort of classic 19th century model of how value is made. So our rules and legislation and our institutions are based on the 19th century model, but today we find increasingly it's a social model of production. And so, I mean, look, if we live in an age where value is going to be, you know, based on virtuality or virtuosity, if you will, you know, affective sentiments and this kind of thing, you know, maybe less to do with rationality and more to do with feelings, you know, crowd type behaviors. Then it sort of stands to reason that you know, we're having the kind of problems that we're having on the stock market right now, whereby you can see what the old economists used to call animal spirits, you know, often seem to be guiding people's decision makings, and you find that the stock market moves in kind of like a flock of birds, you know, like there's a kind of a sort of a one bird goes one way, they all go that way, and vice versa, you know. So the model of value in that sense, that sort of capitalism was originally premised on, seems to have collapsed, because the rationality in the market seems to have collapsed. And so the question of how we you know, would find a grand logic of governance, whether neoliberalism or Keynesian, to help us sort of sort out these crises is increasingly unlikely, because those models are all based in the 19th century, and they're too easily leaped over today. You know, the neoliberalism, of course, doubling down on the rationality of the market, Keynesianism valiantly trying to make an effort to sort of create a more socialistic framework for the state, but it's it's bypassed by the giant corporations time and time and time again, who try to basically bully the state into capitulating. And so whether it's the oil spill in Louisiana or some other sort of corporate disaster, the government seems to get pushed around all the time, and I think that's clearly an issue. So, but in a way, all of those were themes that we saw in Hart's talk. This idea of neoliberalism and Keynesianism being dead. One question we can ask is, does declaration, the newer text, add anything else? Well, maybe it does. One thing that's interesting, though, is how it sort of emphasizes something that I think maybe Hart could have emphasized a bit more in his talk, which is that how they're not really interested in dictating the terms of how the multitude should become this princely figure. They're only willing to suggest some of the conditions that this might inhere in achieving this, and also some of the goals. And so I'd like to focus on those today by way of sort of adding depth to maybe adding some depth to